Hello there, I'm Ertan Karpazli. I'm the editor-in-chief of Radio EastMed, and thank you for joining me for Radio EastMed's second podcast, in which we will be summarizing the top stories for the month of February. Last month was our first podcast, and as promised, I am doing my best to make sure that this is a monthly thing. I've delayed the podcast for February by a couple of days, mainly because of the Israeli national elections, which took place on the 2nd of March. I wanted to wait for at least the exit polls to come out. So I have something extra to talk about with you today. So I will be speaking about that, as well as the top story, which is, for me, in my opinion, the fallout between Turkey and Russia over the northwestern Syrian province of Idlib. In addition to that, I will be speaking about troubles in the Aegean regarding refugees, especially on the islands of Chios and Lesbos. I will be speaking about the Libyan conflict, which was last month's top story, as well as the economic problems in Lebanon, and so on and so forth. So without further ado, I will be speaking about the month's top story, which is the conflict in Idlib. Now, for those of you who have been following what's been happening in Idlib, there has been a tussle between the Syrian regime and Turkish Armed Forces over the province. And what's interesting is the role that Russia is playing here. Now, Idlib is unlike other non-regime controlled areas in Syria. Now, when we say non-regime, we are speaking about, the biggest chunk of Syrian territory, which is not controlled by the regime, is east of the Euphrates, which is controlled mainly by the Syrian Democratic Forces, a US-backed faction, a militia, mainly run by pro-PKK YPG members. So we're not talking about that. We are also not talking about the directly Turkish-controlled areas of Afrin, northern Aleppo, so on and so forth. We are talking about an area which is, to be honest with you, predominantly controlled by forces loyal to Al-Qaeda. However, there are around 4 million civilians living in Idlib. And a couple of years ago, Turkey, Russia, and Iran, they came together in the cities of Sochi and in Astana, Kazakhstan, to agree a deal in which Turkey and Russia were in charge of protecting those civilians from any kind of onslaught from the Assad regime. Russia was given responsibility for protecting the outer perimeter of the Idlib province, whereas Turkey was given responsibility for maintaining social order and security within the Idlib province. Under that deal, Turkey established a number of outposts around the perimeter of Idlib, and it was the responsibility of these outposts really to kind of ward off any kind of assault by the Syrian regime into Idlib, which would potentially harm civilians and cause many people to be displaced and to come rushing towards the Turkish border as refugees. For the most part, this deal kind of held. When I say kind of, I mean it held off the the Syrian regime, from launching a direct ground assault on Idlib. There were skirmishes. Often some of these skirmishes were taking place directly next to the Turkish outposts. There were airstrikes, yes. There were shells that were fired into Idlib and from Idlib to Syrian regime-controlled territories as well. There were skirmishes like that. But for the most part, Turkey maintained security and order in Idlib while the Syrian regime was making advances in other parts of Syria against the opposition. Now, after the Syrian regime had taken control of most of Syria besides the SDF-controlled territories east of the Euphrates, the Syrian regime started to turn its focus onto Idlib. So this put Russia in quite a awkward position because on one hand, Russia was a party in the deals of Sochi and Astana to maintain Idlib as a ceasefire and de-escalation zone. But on the other hand, Russia has been backing the Assad regime throughout the war. So Russia had a responsibility to maintain ties with both the Syrian regime and Turkey when it came to Idlib. Now, I believe that Turkey was hoping that if in the event the Assad regime was to start launching an assault on Idlib, Russia would uphold its part of the deal to support Turkey in maintaining the area as a de-escalation zone. However, Turkey, I believe, has been disappointed to see that actually no, Russia has made its position very clear. Russia is supporting the Syrian regime regarding Idlib, and Turkey has been left on the back foot in the province. Now, why is the Syrian regime launching an attack on Idlib now? Now, there are many factors at play here. Assad has long been saying, Bashar al-Assad I'm referring to, the Syrian regime leader, he's long been saying that he will not stop until the regime controls all of Syria. So obviously with rebels and opposition forces in the way in Idlib, the Assad regime were sooner or later going to start some kind of campaign, some kind of offensive to take the city back. But why now? Now, the Assad regime actually is going through a huge economic crisis. Now, obviously with the war, the Syrian economy isn't what it used to be. Not that it was too great to begin with. At the same time, with most of Syria's oil wells in the east of the Euphrates no longer under the control of the Syrian regime, the Syrian regime is struggling to maintain any kind of economic stability in the areas it does control. Now, it does have a few things going for it. It did regain control of the Aleppo province, most of the Aleppo province, particularly the city, a few years ago. Now, the city of Aleppo is actually the biggest city in Syria. It's bigger than the capital, Damascus, and it is the commercial capital of Syria. So with Aleppo under its control, that gave the Syrian regime a bit of a boost, economically speaking, as well as strategically speaking. Also, the Syrian regime controls the coasts of Syria. It controls the ports of Latakia and Tartus. So the Syrian regime has access to the sea, has access to sea trade. However, there was one thing that was getting in the way, and particularly over its grip on Aleppo, and that's the fact that the rebels in Idlib also had control of the M5 highway, which connects Aleppo with pretty much the rest of Syria. So that M5 highway, it runs from Aleppo southwards towards the cities of Hama, towards Homs, towards Damascus. It is the, you could call it the jugular vein of Syria in a way, and it runs past Aleppo as well. It also connects Aleppo to the east of the country, the northeast of the country, and it goes on to enter its neighboring countries. So without control of this road, trade between Damascus and Aleppo was always going to be slowed down. So the Syrian regime needed to take control of the entire length of this highway in order to connect the two cities, in order to speed up trade and welfare within the cities it controls. At the same time, there is the M4 highway, which connects the M5 to the port city of Latakia as well. So with the Syrian rebels, with Al-Qaeda related forces controlling this junction where the M4 and the M5 meet in a town called Sarakib, they were a thorn in the side of the Syrian regime, and the Syrian regime couldn't conduct its domestic economic activities the way it wanted to, so long as it did not control this town. Now, as I mentioned, Sarakib, it's a town in Idlib, and it sits on the junction of the M4 and M5 highways. It cuts off Aleppo from Damascus as well as Latakia. So a lot of the Syrian regime's efforts to advance in Idlib have been focused on this town. And they did take control of the town early on in the month. But they did briefly also lose control of the town, according to media reports, with Turkish-backed forces taking control of the town. But this only lasted a couple of days before the Syrian regime regained the territory. Now, why is Russia supporting the Syrian regime despite its previous deals with Turkey and with Iran for control of the Idlib region? Now, there are many theories behind this, but we can see that Russia has been, in a way, playing the role of a third Rome in recent times. It tries to fashion itself and present itself as the third Roman Empire, in that it supports the Orthodox Christian communities of the Middle East, as did its previous regime under the Tsars. Now, it also at the same time is supporting more socialist and communist left-wing elements within the Middle East as well, in respect to its former glorious days as the Soviet Union, in which it was supporting communism. So it's kind of playing both sides here. Now, with Russia trying to support the Orthodox communities, now obviously there is not so much of an Orthodox community no longer left in the Middle East to actually set up functioning Orthodox states and regimes and etc. But by supporting the more socialist elements, by supporting groups like the Assad regime, which champions more minority groups within Syria and within the Middle East, it gives that Orthodox element a bit of a boost, as well as a boost for other minorities, in that it weakens the majority group of Syria, which is the Sunni Muslim population. So Russia has something at stake here. Russia has a proxy in Syria that it wants to maintain. Now, if Russia was to, like Turkey, start backing the more majority population, the Muslim Sunnis of Syria, then they put their proxy, their natural allies in the Middle East, at risk, in that if the Sunni Muslims were to become more dominant and more powerful in the Middle East, Orthodox communities and other minority communities may become more marginalized. There is that fear there. However, Russia cannot completely declare war on Turkey, because Turkey has somewhat of a leverage. Turkey controls the Bosphorus Straits, and a lot of Russian ships that send military aid to Syria have no choice but to pass through the Bosphorus Straits in order to get to the Mediterranean Sea and provide that help. At the same time, Turkey has been cozying up a lot more to Ukraine, which is Russia's arch rival in Eastern Europe, particularly over the issue of Crimea, where there are around 300,000 ethnic Tatars who are very close to Turkey. Turkey traditionally has also been a player in the Balkans and in the Caucasus, areas where Russia is seeking control, but they struggle to overcome anti-Russian elements, particularly from native Muslim populations, such as in the Balkans. We're talking about the Chechens. In the Caucasus rather. Now, Turkey, if Turkey wanted, they could actually start inciting some kind of trouble in the Caucasus against Russia, and this is not something that Russia can afford right now, because if trouble was to start in the Caucasus, if the war with the Chechens, for example, was to restart, and if the Chechens were actually successful this time, it could cut off the land bridge between Ukraine and Kazakhstan, completely cut off Russia from the oil-rich region of the Caucasus, and also cut off Russia from access from the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. It is not a war that Russia can afford to have right now, especially a war that they can afford to lose, because it would literally destroy Russia economically. So if Turkey, was pushed to the point that it was to close Russian access to the Bosphorus, the only way Russia could ever actually get them to reopen it by force would be some kind of military action directly against Turkey. But Turkey, keep in mind, is a NATO ally. So any attack on Turkey by Russia would automatically bring in Turkey's NATO allies. Now, it did come very close to the brink of war in Idlib. Just a couple of days ago, at the end of February, a Turkish battalion or brigade was hit directly by an airstrike. Now, there's a bit of confusion on who carried out the airstrike. Turkey subtly is implying that the airstrike was carried out by the Syrian regime, but many people on the ground have been reporting that it was actually a Russian airstrike. This airstrike killed, at least by Turkey's admission, 33 of its soldiers at an outpost in Idlib. However, I've been hearing reports from the very beginning that the death toll was much higher. I cannot verify these reports, but these reports are out there. So that has put Turkey in a very awkward position. Now, Turkey, in order to leverage Russia's betrayal, Turkey has been cozying up a lot more to NATO. There's now talk about Turkey requesting US Patriot missiles in opposition to the S-400s they ordered from Russia. Now, whether the US will actually go ahead with this, I'm not too sure. Now, in the US, regarding Turkey, there is somewhat of a schizophrenia. There are elements that are a lot closer to President Donald Trump who want to support Turkey in the region, but they cannot, because they're often being blocked by efforts in the Senate and efforts in the Pentagon, who are a lot closer to Israel, who don't want to see Turkey grow too powerful in the region. So Turkey has also been trying to get the US, particularly, as well as the European NATO countries, to enforce some kind of no-fly zone in Syria, in which Russia and the Syrian regime would not be able to carry out airstrikes on civilians in Idlib. But at the same time, NATO and the US, again particularly, has been reluctant to give Turkey this support because they cannot risk a direct conflict with Russia in an area that, quite frankly, is not NATO territory. If it was in Turkey, that's a different issue, because Turkey is NATO territory, and if Russia was to attack Turkish territory, NATO would have to defend it. But when it comes to Syria, Syria is not NATO territory, and it's, quite frankly, fair game. So so NATO cannot take that risk. It cannot take the risk that it did in Libya, because Libya at the time did not merit so much of a Russian reaction, whereas Syria, it's Russia's back garden. Russia will not let it go easily. Now, another question that may arise is, well, why doesn't Turkey just pull out of northwestern Syria? Why doesn't Turkey just leave Syria to the Syrians and mind its own business and not get pulled into any type of conflict. In the end of the day, a lot of the Syrian opposition parties who were part and parcel of the Sochi and Astana deals are actually no longer in existence. They have been ousted by Al-Qaeda linked groups such as HTS, which were not party to those agreements, and they do not have any kind of special agreement with Turkey that merits Turkey's protection. So why is Turkey there? Now, we have to keep in mind that Turkey is very insecure about any kind of hostile force coming up very close to its borders, particularly in its southeastern border region of Hatay, which is literally right next to Idlib on the Turkish side of the border. Very recently, the SDF or YPG, or whatever you want to call them, the predominantly Syrian Kurdish groups, were launching rocket attacks on Turkish territory from territories that they controlled in Syria. And there was a push at one stage, a westward advance of the SDF towards the sea, towards the Mediterranean Sea, because this mainly Kurdish-controlled part of Syria, yes, it has oil, but it's still very much landlocked. So all they really needed was a seaport. So when they were pushing westwards and blocking off Turkey's southern corridor, its southern access point to the Arab world, this movement of SDF and YPG was only going to head one of two directions. Either it was going to head to the Syrian port of Latakia, in which it would fight against the regime for control of that port in order to get direct access to the Mediterranean, or it was going to focus its energies on Turkey's province of Hatay, on the Iskenderun port, in order to get that access. Now, the SDF has been working with the Assad regime ever since the American forces pulled out of Syria. And they are ideologically quite similar to each other in that they're both socialists. Now, when it comes to Turkey, Turkey is a very strong and united country. It would not be very easy to attack Turkey and take the port of Iskenderun while Turkey is in this state of unity and strength. However, we have to keep in mind that as strong as united as Turkey is, overnight anything can change. Now, we had a reminder of that in 2016 in July, when a military coup attempt happened in Turkey, and literally overnight the entire game was about to change. Now, if that military coup had been successful, which it wasn't, but if it had been successful, it wouldn't have been like previous military coups in Turkey, where a new government was just immediately installed and people just got on with it. That coup would have faced resistance, a lot of resistance from supporters of the current government, and Turkey would have been in civil war. There would be a lack of legitimacy in the Turkish administration, with two sides trying to take control. And I believe with the HDP, the predominantly pro-PKK Kurdish municipalities in southeastern Turkey, they could have used the opportunity to call Turkey a collapsed state, a failed state, and to declare independence, unite with the SDF, YPG in Syria, and then launch some kind of offensive together, a united Kurdish offensive, to take the port of Iskenderun. That could have happened. That might have been the situation that we would have found ourselves in today, had that coup attempt been successful, but it wasn't. And at the same time, even today there are still rumors, there are still reports going around that Turkey could face another military coup at any stage. Turkey has rebuffed these rumors. I don't know how true they may or may not be. It's not my place to comment on that. But there is always that threat in Turkey. So Turkey has this insecurity, And in fact, they have a reason to be insecure because we have also seen reports that earlier this year, the Assad regime and the SDF had held talks in which they discussed cooperation in retaking the city of Idlib. The Assad regime requested the SDF support in retaking Idlib, and in return, the Assad regime was going to give the YPG, the Syrian Kurds, support in retaking Afrin, which would have left the Hatay province, Turkey's Hatay province, completely exposed to any kind of attack. Now, keep in mind that also Syria has long made claims over the Hatay province. They consider the Hatay province traditionally a part of Syria. So in a state of war, it's all fair game, really. So Turkey is very insecure about that, and they're going to do their absolute best to make sure that that doesn't happen. So that's why with Turkey's recently announced operation in Syria, Operation Spring Shield, they're not just attacking the Syrian regime in along the perimeters of Idlib. They are also focusing their assaults on the town of Tel Rifat, which is in Aleppo and still under YPG province control. Sorry. So that's Turkey's take on that. Now, on the 5th of March, we are expecting a summit to take place between Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow. Erdogan is expected to arrive in Moscow on the 5th of March to discuss some kind of de-escalation of tensions between Turkish forces and Russian forces. Now, the town of Sarakib, again, will most likely be mentioned. Now, I mentioned that Sarakib, right now as we speak, is under control of the Syrian regime. So that puts Turkey in a slightly weaker position when going into this summit. But at the same time, both Russia and Turkey have been flirting with one country in particular, and that country is France. Because with Turkey now looking to kind of bring in the NATO forces into Idlib in order to strengthen its hand there, Russia is also looking for a way to make sure that that doesn't happen. So Russia is cozying up to France because France nowadays has been going its own way more unilaterally, and has been a big critic of the NATO alliance. France, under President Macron, has been looking more towards a united European army, which could possibly rival or even render NATO obsolete. And France has a good reason for this as well, because France is actually losing its influence, particularly in North Africa and the Middle East, and France is looking to reassert itself in the region. So France is looking for a way in. It's just a matter of who can promise France, who can open the door for France. Now, Turkey is actually giving France that opportunity by inviting them, as well as other NATO countries, to get involved in Syria in order to prevent the slaughter of civilians. Now, what Russia is doing is they are also reaching out to France in order to prevent that from happening. They are trying to give France other incentives in order to veto any possible NATO involvement in the Syrian conflict. Now, another thing that Turkey is doing to balance out the leverage and to make itself seem the more attractive partner in the region is that it has opened its gates for refugees who are seeking to travel into Europe via Greece. And this has been a very strategic and a very intelligent move on Turkey's behalf, because it is shifting the focus of Turkey's alleged failures in the region and turning the focus more onto Greece. Now, I'm going to speak about Greece a little bit later, but what's happening now is you have tens of thousands of refugees, predominantly Syrian, as well as Iraqi, Afghanistani, different refugees from different parts of the world. They are now pressing against Greece's borders with Turkey in order to try and enter Greece. And what Greece is actually doing is they've blocked off the borders. They are using live ammunition and tear gas to deter the refugees. There are rumors that one or two refugees have actually been shot dead, and it's actually making Greece look very bad. It's making Greece look very chaotic and unable to control the situation. And in a way, by making Greece look chaotic, Turkey is making itself look like the more preferable partner in the region. And that's more regarding the Eastern Mediterranean gas dispute, but that's another story. So Turkey is also, by doing so, by allowing refugees to press towards Greece and perhaps enter Europe, he's also reminding European leaders of Turkey's leverage over the political discourse in Europe. Because if all of these refugees start entering into Europe, much like we saw in the first wave of refugees trying to enter Europe, far-right political parties will start becoming more popular in Europe and threaten the status quo. So Europe is basically reminding its NATO allies Turkey is reminding its NATO allies in Europe particularly of its ability to change the game in the continent and entice some kind of European and NATO intervention in Syria on its behalf in order to counterbalance Russia and the Syrian regime in the region. Now, regarding Greece, there have been a number of protests and clashes between locals on the Aegean islands of Lesbos and Chios with Greek police who have been sent as reinforcements from Athens to quell opposition to plans to build refugee centers on these islands. Now, keep in mind that these islands, Lesbos and Chios, they're very small islands with very low local populations, and they've already been overwhelmed with the amount of refugees and migrants who have been arriving on these islands from Turkey mainly. And this was even when Turkey was cooperating and doing their best to make sure that migrants and refugees weren't leaving its shores. However, with the doors and gates now opened, even more refugees and migrants are actually trying to make their way to Greece via the Aegean Sea, while this standoff between local people in these islands and the police is ongoing. So it's a desperate situation. And in fact, I've seen videos and we've heard reports of local people actually using guns and weapons against Greek police from Athens. The local people have been calling these Greek police as hordes from Athens, using a very racist and Turkophobic term to insult them. At the same time, the riot police who have been arriving from Athens have not been too kind to the people either. They've been calling them Turkish seeds, another Turkophobic and racist insult to these island people, referring to them as Greeks who were originally Turks. That's what's actually implied there, but it's implied as an insult. So there have been a number of violent clashes. And in fact, some Greek police who had been sent to the islands, they were staying in hotels, and their hotels were attacked. Some of them were actually dragged out by locals and beaten. So they moved out of the hotels and they moved into army barracks on the islands where they believed it would be a lot safer for them to stay. And the local people also attacked these army barracks as well. They even set fire to the entrance of one of them. So it's been a very tense situation on the islands. And in fact, even the local mayors and community leaders, religious leaders have been expressing support for the locals against the authorities and police from Athens. And even the left wing of Greece, Syriza, under former Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras have been expressing support for the local people, which they argue have been ignored by the current government of Greece. And the current government of Greece has actually been ignoring these people. These people have been long saying that they're overwhelmed. They can no longer take any more migrants and refugees. They cannot host refugee centres, and they've been calling for the governments in Athens to actually take responsibility to move some of these refugees to mainland Greece, and maybe even work with the European Union in order to spread them out across other European Union countries, which would be fair. However, the authorities in Athens prefer to keep these refugees and migrants on these islands, which they have very low populations, and even though they may elect local officials and MPs who are against the current government, their population and their numbers are, quite frankly, not enough to make a major change in Greece as a whole. If these refugees and migrants were to start moving into mainland Greece, and particularly start making their way to Athens, where the majority of Greece's population lives, I think that's about 11 million people roughly in Athens. I'm not too sure about the numbers, to be honest, but the majority of Greek people do live in Athens. Perhaps not quite as high as I thought. But if these refugees and migrants were to start making their way there, it could actually incite people against the government to the point that they will start voting for far-right parties such as Golden Dawn, and it would basically oust the current establishment. So that's the worry of Athens there regarding these refugees and migrants. But the situation on the islands is very tense, and by Turkey opening these gates and allowing refugees and migrants to actually make their way to these islands in huge numbers, it's only going to increase the instability and chaos in Greece, and it's going to make Greece appear to be not a very attractive partner to work with in the Eastern Mediterranean. And I believe that is actually Turkey's intention there, because Turkey wants to be the dominant figure in the Eastern Mediterranean. Turkey wants to be seen as the stable ally in the Eastern Mediterranean and not Greece. And Greece is actually not receiving a lot of the international support that it's actually expecting to help deal with this crisis. Other European countries are equally as worried about accepting migrants and refugees as Greece is, because they fear the same repercussions from the far-right elements within their own countries. And we've seen in Cyprus, quite surprisingly, the Greek Cypriot leader Nikos Anastasiades, he all of a sudden very very one-sidedly, sorry for my stutter there, he decided to shut down the border crossings between North Cyprus, the Turkish Cypriot-controlled North Cyprus, and the Greek Cypriot-controlled South Cyprus. He did not even consult the Turkish Cypriot leader Mustafa Akıncı on this. Mustafa Akıncı himself, despite being a pro-peace president and enjoying good relations with Anastasiades, by the latter's own admission, was not happy with this decision. Now, obviously, the reason for closing these crossings was not, the reason given at least, was not because of refugees and migrants. Cyprus does not have so much of a problem in that regard. The official reason given is actually the spread to prevent the spread of the coronavirus, even though, as far as I'm aware, there are no officially confirmed cases of the coronavirus in Cyprus, either north or south. In fact, the reason that the Greek Cypriot president gave was that there were 3,000 Iranian students in North Cyprus, and Iran is a country that is heavily affected by the coronavirus. So they worry that the coronavirus could spread in North Cyprus first and then make its way over to the south. So that's the reason given, and it could be, you could argue it's a fair reason. But at the same time, people have been questioning, why hasn't the Greek Cypriot president closed the crossings before, when there were outbreaks such as SARS or Ebola and swine flu and all sorts of other diseases that became worldwide epidemics. So people have been suggesting that there is another reason for the closure of these crossings. One reason could in fact be migrants. There have been news reports out there in the Greek Cypriot media with Greek Cypriot officials actually accusing Turkey of weaponizing migrants and intentionally sending them to Cyprus in order to destabilize things there. And also there are tensions between the Greek Cypriot government and Turkey regarding the Turkey's plans to open up the former tourist resort of Varosha, otherwise known as Marash. So that could also be another reason why these crossings have been closed only for a week. But the crossings, they do affect Turkish Cypriots very much as well, especially those who are traveling to Cyprus from outside the country via the official airport of Larnaca, which is in the south, and then they need to cross over to their places of residence in the north. So it's affected them, and it's also affected many Turkish Cypriots who they earn their livelihood. They work in the south, but they live in the north, and they use these crossings daily. So in a way, perhaps one could argue that the timing and the one-sidedness of closing these crossings could be perhaps in a way a decision that was made due to pressure from Athens, which has very good relations with the Greek Cypriot government in Nicosia, to show Turkey that, hey, look, you might be opening your borders in the Aegean and in Thrace, but if we close our borders here in Cyprus, you're going to have a lot of trouble on your hands regarding the economic situation of the Turkish Cypriots. And quite frankly, the economic situation in North Cyprus, the Turkish Cypriot controlled side of Cyprus, already isn't doing very well. Turkish Cypriot exports have been dropping, and it's the situation there is very heavily affected by the situation in Turkey. In fact, it's affected a lot more because North Cyprus is an unrecognized country. It's internationally isolated, and its entire survival depends on doing trade and business with the one country in the world that recognizes it, which is Turkey. The situation in Turkey not being great, Turkey is also not able to spend as much money on North Cyprus as it might like to. And that is really causing trouble for Turkish Cypriots in North Cyprus there. And if they are not able to go to the south to work, to earn their money, and to bring it back to the north, that would just only make things a lot worse. And Turkey might have trouble to deal with if that becomes a permanent thing. But for the time being, it's only for a week, and they should be opening up again on the weekend. But overall, Turkey is trying to establish itself above Greece as the stabilizing factor, the stable player, the stable partner in the Eastern Mediterranean, in order to get backing for its deal, its maritime demarcation deal they struck in December with the officially UN-backed government of Libya, which obviously angers Greece because the maritime demarcation deal between Turkey and Libya, from Greece's point of view, infringes on its own exclusive economic zone, its drilling rights for hydrocarbons in the region. And I spoke more about that in last month's podcast. If you would like more information, then please refer to last month's podcast via my social media channels or Radio EastMed's YouTube channel.